I know the film played a few weeks ago at the London Film Festival, and was reported that you didn't go because on the advice of your attorney.
Yeah, I mean, so after the destruction of the hard drives and also the detention of David at Heathrow, David Miranda, that you see in the film, there was a lot of legal meetings in Berlin where, Spiegel brought in their lawyers, and we just talked about what the risks were if the UK government was going to, try to do something to shut down the reporting. So yeah, my lawyer says that there's a risk to travel to the UK, that something similar, sort of detention at the airport, could happen.
What do you think, that somehow they will somehow make some kind of reform that will somehow placate any kind of unease among the American population about the invasion of privacy?
I worked on another film as executive producer called 1971, which is an extraordinary film that actually led to the revealing of COINTELPRO, and which led to the Church Committee and then the FISA court. I mean, I think what we're seeing now is sort of a different era with similar issues. So, but the different era being technologically what's possible. So with the rise of the internet, with, the capabilities of intelligence agencies have so vastly expanded that that the questions are somewhat different now, because the technology is sort of outpacing democratic oversight, and which I think is maybe a bit different than what we saw in the 70s. But there's things that are completely parallel. So I think that what has happened, for instance, in the Muslim American community in the U.S. post 9/11, with the kind of sending informants in and surveillance of that community, is very similar than what we saw in the 60s and 70s when the FBI was infiltrating communities. So, I mean, in terms of what I think the good news is that there are technological ways that we can take back privacy through use of encryption, and we're seeing more and more of that. And so we're seeing movement in that realm, and I think we're seeing movement in sort of people's consciousness of what the capabilities of intelligence agencies, what they are today. And I think that's thanks to what Snowden has revealed. I think what is the most disappointing is how our government has responded in terms of really trying to have policies that rein in these programs. So I think that's still unknown.
I was just curious about your decision to come back for the first time, probably in April for the Pulitzer, but what were the risks that you faced, and with what legal advice, and what circumstances might be facing you now in terms of detention or subpoenas or whatever?
My feeling was that I wanted to finish the film before I came back, because I was worried if I were subpoenaed that I'd get drawn into a legal battle with the government that would sort of just distract me from finishing the film or from reporting. And Glenn really felt strongly that it was the right time to do it, and that we should just push the issue, and that it was on the occasion of the Polk Awards, and that to do that it sort of would maximize the political pressure of going, and if they were to subpoena us. So he flew to Berlin. And we both had a lot of legal meetings, which I had before going to Hong Kong, and then throughout working on the reporting, and the risks were legal risks were sort of a spectrum of subpoena, which would be if the government tried to compel us to testify, or I could be subpoenaed for my footage, which was what I was most worried about, and which was the reason I definitely felt like working in Berlin was the right place for me to be. And then sort of a worse case scenario would be that we'd be held as material witnesses, where we potentially couldn't travel. If we came, and potentially couldn't leave. And then beyond that, it would start to get into actually charging us, and which has never happened. It's never happened that journalists have been charged under the same laws that Snowden is facing, and other whistleblowers. But before I went to Hong Kong, my lawyers were saying, well, it's never happened, but just because it's never happened,
you could be the first.
It won't happen. And the most disturbing precedent for that was James Rosen, the Fox News reporter, who was described as a co-conspirator in a leak investigation case. So you had an example of a journalist being described as a co-conspirator by the government, so that the government could collect his records, and there was actually an outrage. I mean, there was a lot of people were really disturbed by that, and also disturbed by the subpoenaing of the AP records to find a source. So those things happened right before we went to Hong Kong. Which says something about the kind of climate that we're living in, right? That the government is pursuing journalists and whistleblowers who are working on these kinds of stories, and so it definitely I was nervous, and so we flew. We actually had a lawyer on the plane, but we weren't stopped or questioned.
I was just wondering what you want audiences to do in the wake of this. What do you see as the possibility afforded by the film?
I mean, honestly, as a filmmaker, I'm trying to make a film to express something, and so hopefully that it communicates and that you feel something and that you learn something. I mean, so it's not necessarily like a film towards another goal other than to reach people and to communicate something about what I think is, a really what I think is really a threat to democracy, what's happening in terms of what these intelligence agencies are doing. So, it's not really a call to action in that sense. I mean, I'm really a filmmaker, and that's kind of what it's an end in itself in that way. But there are things that people can do. So, for instance, if you wanted to secure your communication, there are things that we link to on our website. I think that probably the easiest and most important tool that's available out there to secure or to ensure anonymity on the internet is the Tor browser, which allows you to search the internet using multiple hops and encryption, so that if you don't want to tie anything that you're interested in with any searches, then you can use that. And there are also other types. There's encryption for email and for chat and for phone and text message. And that would be the thing I would urge people to do, is that not to wait for the government to change their policies, but to use tools that are available right now. And those are tools that are free and that are being built, by people who are interested in social justice, not in sort of profit model, and they're not that hard to find. So I think that, that's, in a sense, the positive news.
A lot of filmmakers have an issue where they are with the subject for a long time, and you spent quite a bit of time with Ed Snowden, and how have you learned to sort of distance yourself, especially considering that there are external forces forcing you together in some regard?
Actually, I spent less time with Snowden than I have with anyone else I've ever filmed. It was, it was about 8 days in Hong Kong and a couple of days in Moscow, so it wasn't actually a lot of time. I mean, there is a balance between the fact that that even though he's came forward with his identity, there are still some things that I feel like as a journalist that are confidential that I'm not going to talk about. So there's that kind of thread. But in terms of I mean, I am trying to make films where you understand who people are, and so what I felt is he in this hotel room was made this decision in his life that I thought was pretty, that he was in a pretty extraordinary circumstance, and that what was happening with him and Glenn and the reporting, it was what I was interested in, what I wanted to document. And so I didn't, I wasn't so interested in going into backstory and those things, but understanding why someone would take the risks that he took, and to understand those motivations. That was sort of my main concern. I've been making, I've been doing this sort of same type of film. So it's a cinema verite. So I'm filming things that are happening in real time and following particular people and the narrative, and I'm interested in what we learn from that. And so this is very consistent. So I was, in terms of what his motivations were, I mean, they are, represented in the film. I mean, he really feels that, that these surveillance programs are a threat to democracy, and that we as citizens have a right to know what our government's doing. I mean, that's his motivation. And people can, I think, reach their own conclusions. I think audiences are smart, and you have, an hour to spend, in a hotel room and to sort of make your own judgment of whether or not you think that was the right decision or the wrong decision, and that's the sort of filmmaking that I've been doing for years, and I'm interested in sort of understanding people. And so for me, the narrative is about him, but other people who are coming forward and saying what's happening in this country. There are some real questions in terms of the government's lack of transparency, the sort of use of secrecy, and people coming forward and taking risks to discuss these things. And so you have previous whistleblowers, and that's the story I was interested in telling, because it's actually something I believe is happening right now. I mean, I think that it's a problem if our government has secret interpretations of laws and secret courts and making decisions like that, because we live in a democracy. So that's the story that I wanted to tell.
Thank you very much for coming. Thanks especially to Laura Poitras.